First of all, a warm welcome to everyone. Today we'll focus on a very practical topic, why strategy so often fails to translate into portfolio decisions in biopharma R&D and what to do about it. First, a very quick introduction. So David and I have both spent most of our career inside biopharma organizations working directly on portfolio decisions. So that's a topic we are very passionate about, and we hope that will shine through today. And our focus is helping organizations make R&D capital allocation more rigorous, explicit, and defensible. Also, what we like to call R&D spend, you can defend. So, what we'll cover today, you see here. We'll briefly introduce the webinar series, which we have dubbed R&D Spend You Can Defend. And we'll go over what strategy actually is and why most fail the test. And then we go to that disconnect we see between strategy and portfolio decisions. And David will take us through the 5 critical pitfalls of why we fail to integrate our strategy into the portfolio decisions. We'll also go over what good then looks like. What does it take to make R&D spend defensible? We have a few housekeeping rules. You see that in the gray box. So the webinar is recorded, and we'll share the slides and recording with everyone after the session here. And again, please use the chat for any questions you may have, and we'll do our best to answer them during the webinar here. So let's dive in. And as we like to state, we see that today R&D spend is quite difficult to defend. As we know, we have a return on investment challenge on biopharma R&D today. The return on investment is basically zero, if you're a little bit blunt. And it's not because the science is weak, it's basically because the decision system is incomplete or broken within the organizations. And that's what we will unpack today. And also this R&D spend you can defend framework sets the broader agenda for this whole webinar series, which will run over the coming months. And today we'll focus specifically on this first lens of the wheel here, the strategy lens, which is one of the 6 critical lenses. So let's try to figure out what we're actually talking about when we talk about strategy. And unfortunately, there is no agreed upon definition of strategy, but at least there are some useful frameworks that point in the same direction. So that's at least a start. And we're not going over every strategy school out there, but of course we have multiple, like good old Michael Porter, where his philosophy is that strategy is very much about the external environment and finding a position within that environment. Rumelt will say it's all about defining the problem. And then we have the Roger Martin, Lafley, where it's all about this integrated choice cascade. I'll get back to that in a second. And then we have something like Prahalad and Hamel, where it's all about the internal capabilities and competencies of the organization. You can see there's a really rich mix of philosophies here. And of course, we also have the blue ocean, where it's all about creating a new uncontested market space. But at least they share some attributes here. You can see it's all about choices and trade-offs, and I would add painful in front of trade-offs, because it's only a strategic trade-off if it's really painful and you decide what not to do. And just to, if we were to recommend one book on strategy, it's probably this one, Playing to Win. I think that's the sort of the most practical, easy to apply framework, and it's really helpful for both using that framework at the corporate strategy level, but also at R&D strategy level and R&D portfolio strategy level. So this is basically that strategy is about creating this integrated set of choices to define your superior value position among your competitors. So just think about this. If you have to think about strategy, then the very short answer is to think about where to play and how to win. Then you are off on a pretty good start. So I think it's important also to go over here what strategy is not, because we see very often that organizations, they don't have, you can actually not tick the boxes where you say this is actually something that qualifies or has the merits of a proper strategy. Something we see often, and you've probably seen it as well, is that it's not a plan or budget. And the reason is that a plan explains what you will do, but it doesn't explain why it will win. And the budget, of course, it shows how you will distribute capital for your projects and so on, but it doesn't define the logic of that competitive advantage you are trying to establish. And similarly, sometimes we see, these high-flying aspirations or the vision, and that's good. It's nice to have be ambitious, but it doesn't tell us how to achieve it. And also, it's not about operational excellence or best practice. And sort of in terms of R&D portfolios, we often talk or R&D organizations at scale, we often talk about this R&D productivity. And that's not a strategy because it doesn't, of course, it'll make you run your trials faster and maybe cheaper and with higher probability of success. And that's a good starting point, but it doesn't offer sustained advantage because over time, your competitors, they will just sort of get to the same level of operational excellence. Also, it's not about pure market selection. Because just picking a space, say we are the rare disease company, it doesn't tell you why you're really different. So that doesn't do it as well. Also, it's not about capabilities because they are just inputs, but it doesn't tell us how you will use the capabilities to win. And then obviously you cannot just be an ad hoc organization and say, let's react to opportunities as they arise, because then your choices will not be coherent over time. So I think these are some of the hallmarks we need to see to really say, okay, this strategy is actually a strategy. And just to make it sort of very simple, so here's I picked a few pieces of text, not to mention the specific companies here, but if every time you see like a strategy that claims to be wanting to be the best or the number one in whatever field, it's usually not. It's like at least a yellow warning flag that strategy is maybe not really defined in the proper terms. And you can see each of these small quotes here I digged out. It's really, again, these are about goals, capabilities, plans, but they're not strategies, because in and of themselves, they don't include the choices and trade-offs. So it's not strategy. And here's a small test. You can, and I encourage you to, after the session here, maybe test it in your next meeting with your colleagues to really see if your organization really has a strategy. And don't be embarrassed if you don't have, because I think it's as we put here at the bottom, that most biopharma strategies actually fail this test, that they don't have that sort of overarching clear diagnosis, the core challenge the organization is facing. They're not crisp on what the success really looks like, the objectives and the quantitative targets, and it doesn't force painful trade-offs. So again, just to emphasize, we really want to see that it's clear where to play, and perhaps more importantly, where not to play. And of course, there's the fear of missing out. So it's really hard to define this, where we're not going to play, and let some opportunities go and say they're better handled by other companies and their strategies. And then I would say it's also important, of course, to have the critical assumptions there, and we'll get back to that because we are operating in an extremely risky industry. But let's move on. So now I just went through some of the sort of, again, the hallmarks of strategy, applying to both the corporate strategy, but also R&D strategy and portfolio strategy. So now we say, okay, what is then special about a portfolio when we talk about portfolio strategy? And you're maybe familiar with, now I picked here a fairly sort of dry definition of what is a portfolio from the Project Management Institute. But I think what is important here is that we should really remember that the portfolio is the vehicle for executing the corporate strategy in biopharma. And it's of course, a portfolio is about the assets, the molecules we have, and that's the way we drive the strategic objectives of the enterprise. So that's where we see the strategic objectives of the organization being achieved. And we also have the sort of the way we measure success for a portfolio. That's the aggregate investment performance of that portfolio. But I think this is maybe a little bit sort of a technical, and this applies across industries. So David and I, we have depicted it in a little bit, let's say, more pharma relevant context, how we can define and look at a portfolio. So we like to see it as a portfolio, an R&D portfolio, a pipeline, as a set of bets on the future. And the portfolio strategy then becomes how you allocate capital to shape that risk and hopefully skew the outcomes in your favor over time. And we also introduce here on this slide something which is very critical and very important for R&D pipelines and R&D portfolios, and that's these time horizons. And here we have 3: short, medium, and long term. And that's often where organizations, they run into trouble, because how do you balance the short term versus the medium term and long term? And as you can see, the longer time horizon we're looking at, the more this futures cone expands, and then we will have a wider range of possible outcomes for the portfolio. Of course, I mean, if it's not, for many companies, it's not completely unlikely that the entire pipeline will actually fail if we don't course correct over these time horizons. Of course, we can also get the wild success, but at least we have to think about portfolio outcomes as a continuum of possible future states, and we have to plan the portfolio in a way that it will have some robustness to these outcomes. So we're not planning for one particular outcome, the base case or expected path we often see in our long-term projections on the portfolio. So this is a very important concept, and David will get back to some of these elements in the pitfalls. And now to sort of complete the view, because obviously it's, I mean, if we work on R&D portfolio strategy, we think that's the center of the universe, but or maybe the universe actually extends to include the entire R&D organization. But in reality, we know that we have, a business development strategy, CMC strategy, maybe a people organization strategy with capacity execution limits. We have the commercial functions, and it all needs to play together like an orchestra. And we have to agree on what good looks like and have this seamless integration. And as we all know, there are, this cross-functional alignment, just the sheer complexity of it is hard enough, but then of course we add humans and the biases and the politics. So that's why it's really, there's so many elements that really need to be in the right constellation for the R&D portfolio strategy to be smoothly executed.
Simon, we've had a quick question come in, which is with regards to strategy, what's the benchmark of how often you should revisit or update a strategy at a company level or a department level, and what determines when you should kind of challenge or rewrite that strategy?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because we are sure when we start out with our pipeline, it will look different in maybe next year or in 3 years or whatever. So of course you cannot just execute the pipeline and then everything will be fine. So I think sometimes we usually have the usual cadence of a portfolio review every year or twice a year, unless I think that's sort of the housekeeping exercise, and that could trigger, if we realize that maybe we are drifting with our portfolio, then we should trigger. So I think the housekeeping would be maybe yearly to make sure we are on track, but obviously we would also have sort of event-driven triggers of a portfolio review where you can say, okay, if you lose your biggest phase 3 asset, then that probably triggers a strategy revision, because maybe your strategy is not meaningful anymore. So I think that's the short answer, at least the housekeeping exercise once or twice a year, and then it should be event-driven. And then I think it's also specific for the company. So how do you actually plan and lay out also the sort of the investment envelope? How much are we willing to commit? Is it like, will the R&D organization get like a 3-year rolling budget to operate within, or is it only a 12-month budget? So I think that depends a little bit, but that would be sort of my my quick remarks on that question. So thanks a lot for the question, and keep the questions coming in the chat. So final slide before I hand it over to David. So this session here is very much about how do we actually make sure that we have this connection from the highest level of strategy in the company, the corporate strategy, which sets the overall sort of scope, ambition, and capital envelope for the entire enterprise for the next 3, 5, 10 years potentially. So that's what you call the intent layer. That's what is the intent of the organization, and then that of course travels down to the R&D part of the organization, and then need within that corporate strategy to then define where and how scientific choices are made and how they create the advantage to compete. And we made the arrow sort of pointing in both directions, because obviously, I mean, there is feedback traveling up towards the corporate strategy. Again, if you have, I mean, a major setback in your pipeline, you have to revisit this corporate strategy, or maybe you have an unexpected catastrophic success in the pipeline. You might also want to revisit this corporate strategy and maybe fund more than you had originally anticipated. But then if we continue the journey downward here a bit, so the R&D strategy, and then we look at the R&D portfolio strategy, which we are then linking with the portfolio decision layer, and we have termed it portfolio control layer or the portfolio control system. So we would like to have you think about it as comprised of two components. So there's like the portfolio strategy sets the rules for how capital is allocated across programs. So that's like the overall philosophy, rules, guardrails, and then we have the actual each individual, the portfolio decisions, how the decisions are made, how do we decide what to advance, fund, terminate, and so on. So I think that's a good sort of a mental model to think about this. So with that, I will hand it over to you, David, to take us on a quest.
Thanks.
I can see we have a question we can maybe address before we make the transition. So what role, if any, should the competitive landscape play in the portfolio review process? I imagine you don't want to revisit your portfolio and or strategy every time there is an external event. Should you have internal assumptions for external events and any deviation from those assumptions? So I think I'll give maybe I answer that quickly, and you can add if you want, David. But obviously, your pipeline doesn't exist in a vacuum, so you have to be extremely aware. And in some organizations, you have the competitive intelligence sitting in the same team as the portfolio team. So I think it's a must that it should be very, very firmly integrated into the portfolio review process, because you cannot neglect competition today. And I was just earlier this week in Basel also talking about how we see that the time between the first entrant of a new molecule within a mechanism of action class and the second entrant, that's now less than 1 year. So if you sit there, then you lose out of competition. So it's so fierce. So obviously, asset teams should be encouraged and forced to take competition into account. And I think it should also trigger, I mean, an external event, a competitor readout could trigger a portfolio review potentially. So you can't get enough competitive intelligence for sure.
Yeah, the one addition that I'll make to that, Simon, because I think that's exactly right, that the integration of that competitive landscape into the portfolio strategy is critical. But you also shouldn't go through the process a bit similar to what you were describing of predicting a single scenario for your own portfolio. You shouldn't build your portfolio strategy entirely off the basis of competition doing one thing or one thing materializing out of what competition are doing. And so you need to make sure that when you're doing your portfolio review and considering your portfolio in light of the competition, that it's robust to the various different scenarios of potential outcomes that might come out of that competitive landscape. What if they're successful in this particular phase 3? What if they fail in that particular phase 3? Your portfolio and your portfolio reviews, therefore, should be robust to those types of decisions in advance. So thank you for that, Simon. As we go into this next section, really what we're starting to look at here is to answer the question why most portfolios actually fail to reflect the corporate strategy that's in place. And I think this is about identifying what are the common pitfalls that organizations fall into when they are going through the process of translating between the corporate strategy and their portfolio strategy, and then ultimately make the decisions on the actual assets or other investment choices that they have in front of them. Now, the picture that is in the background here may look a little incongruous to this as a topic, and I think there is a tendency for us in R&D to think of R&D in biopharma as an incredibly complicated, incredibly sophisticated space, which it is, but also to naively assume that the problems that the organizations are therefore facing are incredibly complex, incredibly difficult, and very unique to the R&D and biopharma environment. And actually what we see is the challenges that many organizations face in this translation between the corporate strategy and the portfolio strategy appear in many other contexts and in many different ways. And so I often use this analogy, as it were, of a fairy tale or a hero on a quest as a little mnemonic device to help me remember the different kind of portfolios and therefore, different pitfalls, and therefore hopefully to avoid these different pitfalls that organizations can find themselves in. So today what we'll go through is what I'd call the 5 common pitfalls of translating between corporate strategy and the R&D portfolio strategy. So this is around, as Simone was describing before, the move between the intent layer of the strategy and the control layer of the strategy. And one of the often there are a number of pitfalls that organizations fall into in that space, and we give them these 5 different names, and I'll go through the details on each of these in a second. But I also wanted to stress one further bonus pitfall, as it were, which is about how when we put that strategy into operation, when we actually go about making decisions on assets in real, not in the design of the strategy, there's often a pitfall that organizations fall into as well, which I think any conversation about strategy can't exclude. So I'll also take you through that 6th bonus pitfall about losing the map as well. So starting at the very kind of top of the pyramid, as it were, with regards to intent, one of the major challenges that organizations fall into is the translation at the very first level between the corporate strategy and the R&D goals and metrics. So this is really about identifying where we want to get to. What's the treasure at the end of the path that we're looking to find? And I think many corporate strategies are written understandably with the entire enterprise in mind, not with just R&D in mind, and therefore aren't explicit to what needs to occur and needs to happen in R&D. And so what some organizations do is they fail to actually take those corporate objectives and ambitions and translate those into specific actionable R&D versions. And so you can imagine some organizations, as Simone was outlining before, have an ambition to be #1 in oncology. What does that mean from an R&D perspective? Does that mean we're looking for the next mega blockbuster in oncology, or does that mean we are looking in R&D to have a footprint in many different disease areas in oncology? There are choices that need to be made. Similarly, some organizations will have a specific ambition around filling a gap with regards to top level turnover growth in a particular year as a result of a patent expiration or whatever it might be. And that might exist at a total corporate level. We need this amount of growth, or we're looking for this amount of revenue in this given year. But actually, what does that mean from an R&D perspective? What is it that's R&D is being held to account for versus what BD versus commercial versus other parts of the organization, and how do they all come together? And so if you don't do that activity of converting between your kind of ambition at the macro level and the specificity that you require in R&D can often be set up not to succeed, because it's it's not pointing to the right goals in the first place. The other challenge that can appear in this space is that the goals exist, but they're not appropriately prioritized. And so often when it comes to making decisions in practice, you've got a portfolio in front of you, you've got to choose which assets you're going for. Having a prioritized set of those metrics that really our number one goal is XYZ can really help set the direction and the tone for those discussions and decisions as they happen. The second challenge that organizations fall into once they have a well-defined set of goals is that they find that their ambition isn't grounded in the reality of where the organization actually sits. And so as a result of that, they underestimate the scale of change that's required in order to deliver against that ambition. And so they acknowledge there's a gap, but they don't actually ever measure it. And if you don't ever measure it, then you don't need to really determine how much investment it's going to take. And so you end up in this world of continuous tension in the organization, which is never going to resolve because the investment isn't there. Now, often this measurement of that gap actually fails at the very first hurdle, which is you have a set of strategic objectives, but actually really mapping out what your current capabilities and your portfolio reality are is actually really difficult. And in some cases, surprisingly difficult for very easy questions. I've worked with organizations in the past where, even answering the question, given our spend in R&D, how much of that is actually committed versus uncommitted? Where is that spend actually being utilized? How much flexibility do we have? Is hard for organizations to answer. And if you can't answer the question on where you are today, it then becomes very hard to know what investment you need in order to fill the gap to get where you want to be tomorrow. The other challenge that some organizations face into is that they look at the gap between their current reality and the strategic objectives, but only through a single lens. So they might look at it through, do we have the right assets, or do we have assets in our portfolio which we think will fill that gap and reach us to our strategic objectives? But they fail to look at that gap through the lens of kind of the time it will take in order for those things to deliver versus the time outlined in the strategic objectives. Or critically, and this is probably the one that's forgotten most often, is from a capability perspective. Do they have the capabilities that they need in the organization, to not just the assets, in order to bridge the gap between where you want to be and where you are today? And actually that obviously filling any gaps that there are in that capability is a big investment decision and a big structural decision for any organization as you're going through that. The third challenge, and this I should say as a statistician, I'm a statistician by background, is probably my favorite one, I call ignoring the bogeyman, is all about how we think about and manage risk in R&D in biopharma. Now, it constantly surprises me, or amazes me, I should say, how organizations surprised every day about outcomes that happen in their R&D, when really, we're in an organization which is fundamentally built on risk. The entire industry is built on risk, and everyone acknowledges that it's built on risk. But very, very few organizations actually go through the process of appropriately calculating what that risk is, managing that risk, and then critically incorporating that risk thinking into their decision making. Simon touched on this earlier when he was talking about that kind of cone of possibilities. I think many strategies are built on the median or the mean of the expected outcomes over time, over short, medium, and long-term horizons. But actually, what organizations should be doing is really calculating and understanding that full distribution of potential risk and uncertainty that they're facing into, not just using single point estimates. As a result of not looking at the risk or not calculating and managing that risk, many organizations are taking risks which aren't linked to their risk appetite and tolerance. It may be that they're not taking enough risk. Risk is a tool and an advantage for organizations who are who are managing it appropriately. But if you're not calculating it, you can't really understand how much you're taking and therefore whether that's right for your organization. The other thing that organizations tend to do when it comes to ignoring the risk bogeyman is not appropriately scenario planning. And we touched on this when we were talking about the competitive landscape question earlier. But actually, we don't want to get into analysis paralysis where we're trying to scenario plan every potential outcome of every potential clinical trial that we're running. But for your major decisions, for your major programs, for the major potential outcomes, you should be planning in advance. If this were to succeed, if this were to fail, then it has this implication over the strategy and what we would do next. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to you if you need to act and what you need to be doing in that situation. And so as part of that, one of the things that you should be very closely monitoring and tracking are the kind of inflection points that will mitigate or manage that risk as your projects go through the pipeline. From an organizational perspective, one of the challenges that pitfalls that we see people fall into is this concept of reading different stories. So, everyone working to a slightly different interpretation of the strategy. I think many organizations are clear that what you need to do is to ensure that there's alignment between the corporate strategy and the individual. And so what happens is, you have a corporate strategy that gets translated into an R&D strategy that then ladders down to a TA strategy that ladders down to to an individual, and they can see all the way up their ladder between the work they're doing in the corporate strategy. And that's great. But what doesn't happen as often in organizations and is equally as critical is in ensuring that all of those ladders are pointing in the same direction to the same interpretation of the corporate strategy. And so what can happen is a problem right at the top in organizations where the corporate strategies are translated slightly differently for R&D, for BD, for commercial. And this can result in a number of different challenges. I think two of the most common and most pressing ones is that kind of the work that's happening in order to deliver the short-term objectives versus that which is to deliver the long-term health of the company, the sustainability of the organization are not reconciled. And R&D is a place where really both of those things come very much to fruition, because R&D is all about helping to deliver the short term, but also the long-term health of the organization. And so ensuring that you have reconciliation on all timeframes across all parties is really critical. The other is that timing of critical decisions that you're making may not be appropriately synchronized.
And David, can I add to that slide? Sure. Just to make it relatable for everyone? I think particularly it's around portfolio reviews. We see this really shining through and becoming a problem, because if many of you of the participants here are working in portfolio teams across the industry, and sometimes we are tasked with coming up with a portfolio recommendation. So and then the obvious question is, okay, what are we optimizing for? So we have a portfolio optimization problem, but what are we actually optimizing for? And if you ask the decision makers in the organization, they often give very different answers. Maybe if you ask the CFO, he or she might say, okay, we're optimizing for the profitability next quarter. Whereas the head of research is maybe saying we are optimizing to have a strong drug discovery organization. So if you can't really articulate what you're optimizing for, then this exercise is extremely difficult. And we know, portfolio review, it is very much the calculus of sacrifice. What are we not going to do? And you will often see it when you try to agree on a portfolio recommendation, decide on the priorities, that people are not aligned. They don't have the same view on the strategy.
Completely agree. Thank you very much for that addition, Simon. So the final kind of translation or strategy definition pitfall that organizations fall into is what I call getting stuck in the swamp. So this is around how the strategy will actually be implemented in practice and when decisions need to be taken. And so what can often happen when it comes to making decisions in practice is that there are no clear decision rules put in place, for example, for advancing or terminating the assets. The decision rights are unclear, so who's gonna be making what decisions in the process, and also what information, what data is needed in order to support those decision makers in those forums, so that they can make the decision with all of the information that they need at hand. Now, this can create two challenges in the organization. One is that because these things are not defined a priori, it can mean that you end up taking suboptimal decisions because you don't have the information that you need, or you don't have the people that you need when you need to take those, and can result in kind of low value projects persisting for too long and these sorts of things. But it also generates a lot of organizational friction, and it can slow down your operating rhythm as well. So one of the things that we would heavily advocate is that thinking through all of this in advance as part of your portfolio strategy, how you will operationalize that strategy rather than retrospectively trying to do it at the point of decision is a really critical component. So that's some of the pitfalls that we see from a translation perspective. I'll touch on briefly the bonus pitfall around losing your map, because I think we create this shiny vision and a strategy that we want to deliver against. But then when reality hits and we're on the journey, everything starts to look a lot darker, that treasure seems to be further away. And one of the first things that seems to be sacrificed is that our strategy ends up stopping driving our portfolio decisions in the favor of very kind of tactical decision making. And so, as Simon was outlining before, a strategy which doesn't actually drive the decisions that you're taking is not really a strategy at all. And so what can happen is that people end up creating a strategy and then essentially leaving it on someone's desk or ignoring it when the time is appropriate or most critical in order to bring it out. So strategy ends up not explicitly applied in the individual asset decisions, or there's not clarity in that individual governance decision-making forum how that strategy is going to be used. Sometimes strategies are not actively communicated across the organization. They're generated at the C-suite level or at the kind of R&D leadership level, but then not consistently communicated, so that you're in a place where not everyone in the organization can articulate the strategy and therefore make decisions which are aligned to that strategy. And ultimately, you find that sometimes you don't have the measurement or accountability in place to ensure that there is alignment for that strategy for when those individual decisions are being taken. And so without all of this, what happens is that projects tend to drift over time, and there's no strategic course correction to bring you back to deliver the strategy that you're ultimately aiming for, and you end up kind of following ongoing momentum rather than the strategy that you were hoping for aligned to your overall corporate objectives. And so you really need to make sure it's your strategy driving your decisions, not describing decisions that have already been taken.
And I think, David, maybe one sort of very low practical issue we see is, so let's say you have a new budget year, and then it's January, and you have a project coming to governance for some investment decision. So then again, it's too easy to fund that a project at the early of the year because you have fresh money in the bank, but then you might actually have a better opportunity that's better aligned with your strategy that might come in September. So how do you manage that? So it's definitely not trivial to make sure you have the strategic alignment in your portfolio decision. So as you rightly say, David, it's about having the sort of the proper measurements in place that you're actually on track with your strategy, and the accountability for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So how do we go about avoiding these pitfalls? So we've got these pitfalls. We know these are problems that we can fall into. Now the resolution is seemingly quite simple, but in order to actually deliver it is often quite difficult in practice. I won't go through all of the detail here, but in essence, what you need to ensure is that you've got clear metrics, you're quantifying the gap between where you want to be and where you are, you're explicitly modeling your risk, that you've got organizational alignment, that you're clear on your decision rules a priori and how you're going to put those into practice. And then you have clarity in terms of how you're going to embed that strategy into your ongoing portfolio decisions. And if you have failure on these across any of these pitfalls, then what you can end up happening is that you have a disconnection of your strategy from how capital is actually allocated. So the way I think about, therefore, what a good portfolio strategy looks like is, I would say, a complete portfolio strategy doesn't just give you direction. It also tells you how you translate into the decisions that you need to take. So it gives you that direction of travel through clear objectives, explicit guardrails you need to operate under, and some defined priorities. But it also gives you the ability to execute it through kind of your quantified gap versus the current pipeline, your clear approach to closing the gap. How much are you relying on your pipeline to do? How much are you looking for BD to contribute to that gap? How much is coming out of research, etc. And making sure that that approach to close the gap is not fragile, so it's robust to potential risk that you face, and that you have an implementation plan in place and ensure that's embedded into your real decision making. And brought together, those elements ensure that your strategy translates into coherent, defensible portfolio decisions and capital allocation. So to take us back now, I think, to the picture that Simon outlined at the start, this is one component of the lenses that we use in order to make R&D spend and R&D portfolio decision making defensible. There are many other different lenses that need to be in place, and this has been a very brief overview of kind of the some of the things that you need to consider in this space. So just to give you a bit of background in terms of what Simon and I do.
David, before you jump to this, though, I mean, there was a question I can from the chat I can answer while we look at this, because the question is that we have spent some time on this capital allocation piece as the basis for portfolio strategy. So that's basically moving, big pots of money around to the right places in the organization. And the question is, what about human resource allocation, which, unlike capital, is largely non-fungible? And I think that's a very good question, because I mean, you can redeploy your capital, the capital reallocation exercise, we move money around. But what about people? Because you have of course you have limited capital, but you also have a limited number of people and expertise. And if you happen to say, well, what if you get a phase 3 molecule to the market, and then you can't ask the regulatory affairs professionals to go do in vivo models? So how do you manage that? And I think that's a topic we will cover in the subsequent webinars, especially around the portfolio planning, where we also have the portfolio projections, the portfolio modeling, where we also have to factor in about how many chemists would we have, how many statisticians would we have, how many molecules can we launch, and so on. So that aspect as a further constraint in that portfolio optimization problem we will cover in one of the later episodes. So thanks a lot for that. And I think there's now an additional question. Let's take that, David, here. So it's to follow up on the capital and human resource allocation question. So isn't a large chunk of the R&D budget devoted to people's salaries and lab space equipment? Absolutely. So you have, of course, a huge overhead, and it depends exactly how organizations how much they outsource and how much they have as running costs in-house. And then you have obviously portfolio spend, and you have everything else in the R&D envelope. So obviously, yes, you have to decide how big is your organization versus how many assets, but they also go hand in hand, because if you double the pipeline, you probably need more brains and hands to execute that pipeline. So that's, again, something that we'll also think about in the portfolio planning aspect. So that's a very good question, managing the sort of the internal and external capabilities and how you ramp up and down and plan the portfolio and that resource constraint. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I'd additionally say that obviously also your existing kind of your resource of your human resource and your talent pool is a constraint that goes into your overall should be as part of your ambition at the start, because you have the pool of resource that you have. And any changes from that are going to require investment, and so you need to be happy to fund that if that's something that you want to move additionally from. So just in the last couple of minutes of this session, I'll briefly outline some of the work that Simon and I are doing to help organizations in this space, and also talk more about the webinar series that Simon was outlining earlier. So overall, Simon and I, we really as hopefully has come across in this session, are very passionate about the portfolio space and really strengthening capital allocation and overall portfolio decision making, including human allocation discipline across the organization. And so we tend to do this in two ways. One is around advisory work. The other is through helping build capability. That could be through internal capabilities, supporting organizations, or it could be through building external capabilities through webinars and masterclasses and other things like that. But we also have an ambition to build and ensure that there's methods for peer exchange across the portfolio community as people who've worked in the portfolio space historically and wanted more engagement, more of a network across the broader portfolio industry. One of our ambitions is to grow and to build that network as well. So just to make you aware of a couple of things that we have coming up. So we are going to be doing some masterclasses, and the first masterclass, or the next masterclass that we've got coming up, is on R&D portfolio strategy. This will be in the September-October timeframe. This is where we go and we dig into one of those lenses that we outlined in more specific detail through a couple of half-day sessions, limited to kind of up to 10 participants. We are going to be doing some executive roundtables. So these will be invite-only events where we will bring portfolio practitioners together in order to discuss a hot and key topic facing portfolio management in our industry. And then finally, the last thing that I'll touch on is our next webinar in this webinar series. So we're going to be doing a webinar on capital allocation, as Simon was outlining earlier, really looking at how do we take some of the things that we've discussed today and how do we turn that into practical decision making in the organization. So how do we move from a defined set of strategic priorities to the capital allocation? How do we build in all of the other elements that we've been discussing here today in terms of the constraints of the organization into a robust portfolio review? So if you have an interest in hearing more about that, then do reserve your spot. You can scan on that QR code in order to register, and that we will be holding on June the 4th at a similar time as this session. So that was all from me today. I'm conscious that we are coming to the end, or if not slightly over the end of the time that we had allocated. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully this has been useful. It's certainly been something that Simon and I have been very excited about kind of working through. Simon, I don't know if there's any final words or thoughts from your side.
No, and do not hesitate to reach out if there was a question you didn't have time to ask or were too shy. Just drop us a message on LinkedIn or email. But thanks everyone for joining.
Great, excellent, thank you. And just as a reminder, a recording of this session and the slides that we've shared today will be shared with everyone who's registered for this event. So expect to see some links coming for those very shortly. Enjoy the rest of your day.